case you haven't heard, context matters. When it comes to psychedelic therapy, the drug itself is only half the story. Set and setting are the other crucial components, referring to the mindset of the person taking the substance and also the environment that surrounds them during the experience. These factors can influence and shape outcomes. They can make the experience anywhere from traumatizing to healing. But in the world of clinical research, these important factors don't often get a lot of attention. They can go underreported or inconsistently reported or treated like some kind of mysterious black box. And this is kind of bad because if we don't know how to clearly report set and setting, how will we ever uncover their true role and how we can use them to improve psychedelic therapy outcomes? Thankfully, a groundbreaking paper recently published in Nature Medicine is changing that by bringing together international experts to solve the problem of how best to report these contextual factors in psychedelic clinical trials. Hello and welcome to the integration session. I'm your host, Dr. Elena Koning, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by the paper's first author, Dr. Chloé Pronovost-Morgan, whose team led a national Delphi study to establish the first ever standardized guidelines for reporting setting in psychedelic trials. They talked to 89 experts from 17 countries to come up with a set of 30 very important variables that we're going to talk about today, including ones that you might not even think about. We'll also dive into why context in psychedelic trials matters, and the ethics and policy of it all, and how you can use these guidelines to change the way you study and think about psychedelics. Let's get into it. Hello, Chloé, and welcome to the integration session. I'm so glad you're here to join me today. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Elena. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, can we start with just a little introduction? So if you don't mind just giving our listeners a little overview of yourself, your career trajectory, and what led you to be interested in psychedelic research.
Yeah, sure. So just to start with where I'm at now, I just graduated from medical school, and I'll be starting my residency in psychiatry, so specializing in psychiatry at McGill University. But halfway through my medical studies, I actually took a leave of absence, a break, or we could say, and I did a master's in cognitive and clinical neuroscience that was based at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And it's there that I, for the first time, started having a sort of like academic interest in psychedelic therapies. That came from the fact that the program granted us a lot of like time and space to explore our own interests. Our evaluations were through research proposals, and so we could like really dive into the specific literature on different topics. And I guess in parallel, I started becoming a little bit disillusioned with some mainstream psychiatry treatments. I found that there was sort of a disregard for contextual variables or for the sort of container in which the intervention took place. And I found that unfortunate because that does seem to be quite powerful. And then, yeah, at the same time, I discovered what seemed to be quite a different paradigm, the psychedelic paradigm, where those variables are central. And so to me, I think that's really what drew me to it. Obviously, the therapies themselves are also fascinating and seem to be, have somewhat of a revolutionary potential. But I say that with caution because I think we've seen through time a lot of waxing and waning when it comes to new therapies. And it's normal to get really excited, but I think we always have to take it with a grain of salt. And yeah, prior to medical school and my master's, I had done an undergrad in psychology.
Nice. So you've been thinking about the psychology of things for a while then.
Yeah, I've been in school for a while, and I'm really excited to um, get out there and start working.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I like that you mentioned the contextual considerations in psychiatry at large. I think it's definitely an overlooked factor. and especially influential when there's a psychedelic substance involved, which we've seen in the
Yeah.
literature. And you were recently first author on an article that was published in Nature Medicine, so congratulations on that. That's a huge accomplishment.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah, and I'd like to know a little bit more about what motivated you and your group to put together this particular paper. So, what sort of, you mentioned the need for contextual considerations, but what exactly about the field sort of motivated this particular paper?
Yeah, so I think I mean I think we saw a sort of paradox or maybe irony within the field in that there is so much literature and wisdom and knowledge that context matters, or in the field, what we refer to as set and setting matters, right? And that's been said since the 60s, by Timothy Leary and his colleagues. Um, and so this is very much like ingrained knowledge in the field, and it influences the way that people proceed. They pay attention to the environment in which they give psychedelic doses to patients, and they try to cultivate a positive mindset. Um, and yet, when you look at the literature, there's just a huge gap in terms of reporting these factors. And so, on the one hand, we're saying, this matters so much and it's so important and we need to pay attention. And on the other hand, we're really not diligent in how we actually convey what happened within a psychedelic trial. And I think there might be some reasons for that. One of them being that we're trying to fit psychedelic therapies within the frame of like randomized controlled trials and the way we've always done biomedical sciences, which is isolate the drug from the rest, right? Like we want to know what the drug effect is and kind of don't really care about everything else that went with it. Um, and that just doesn't work when it comes to psychedelic therapies. They're so intertwined. I mean, even in the name, it's psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or therapy. The psychedelic, in a sense, is assisting the whole process. And so we need to know what that process was. Um, and, more concretely, we saw a systematic review that had been recently published, and they were looking at some of these contextual variables and how they were reported, and it was pretty bad. So we just thought, okay, well, we need to do something about this. Like this is a like huge gap, and I think we also thought that it would contribute to reducing the legitimacy of the field. If we didn't address this gap, if nothing was done about it, we knew that there had been a first wave and that kind of crashed, and now we were in the resurgence of the second wave, and we wanted to, I guess, proceed with caution. And just for context, I we launched this study during the second year of my master's when I was at Imperial College in London with my colleagues, Dr. Roseman and Dr. Greenway.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. There's a really great group of researchers there in
Yeah,
psychedelic research. So that's great that you got to work with them. But yeah, you're right. Like, there's so many factors that we don't know the exact role that it plays in outcomes. So it does seem kind
yeah,
of silly to be trying to isolate just the psychedelic and not all of these other factors that could be having a substantial impact. So it's definitely an important thing to look at. And maybe for our listeners, just in case anyone's listening that isn't familiar with like what set and setting actually refers to, do you mind just giving a little overview of that? And then we'll talk a bit more about your specific study and then what it showed.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, so set and setting, as I mentioned, was like an expression or a term that was coined by Timothy Leary, who was sort of a pioneer in psychedelic research turned guru, like who fell out of favor. But the term refers to, so set refers to kind of the mindset or the mental state of a person who is going to or taking a psychedelic substance. So that can involve like their expectations relating to it or their mood, whether they're anxious or happy to be going into this, really just the state of their mind at that time. And the setting is the environment in which they take it. So, it could be anything truly. In, the wild, that could be a rave, but in a psychedelic study, that could be, an academic hospital, or it could be a room that looks kind of like a living room and is meant to be warm, etc. So yeah, just the external environment basically.
Yeah, thank you. And your specific study looked at creating guidelines on reporting these sort of things in psychedelic clinical trials. So, what did you
Exactly.
do to sort of approach that task? Like, I know you mentioned in the paper that you took a Delphi method approach. So, do you mind just describing that a little bit for the listeners and the thinking that went into that methodology?
Yeah, definitely. So we knew that, trying to get the field to report on um, setting or these like extra pharmacological variables would be a big task, and we didn't think that it was appropriate for us three, the study leads, to try to come up with the end all be all list, for instance, of important variables. And so we referred to the Delphi method because um, it's this well established, well known method that's often used in healthcare research that enables one to reach an expert consensus on a given like complex topic. And the way it works is that it proceeds by you recruit a whole bunch of experts, and you can define experts in your own way. In our case, we decided that they were, you know, experts by experience, like lived experience, but also like academic knowledge. And so we had some researchers, some clinicians, but also some past clinical trial participants who were in the expert pool. And then you guide these experts through multiple iterative rounds that start quite open-ended and then eventually get more narrow and more narrow and more narrow to arrive ultimately at a consensus. And what is advantageous about this method is that, first of all, it can be conducted online through surveys, so you can get people from all across the world. It's also done in a sort of what we call quasi-anonymous basis, meaning that the study leads know who's saying what, but the experts among themselves don't. And so that can kind of level the playing field if you know that you have some stronger voices in there, and maybe some people who are less opinionated or comfortable normally sharing their voices. And then there's also some flexibility in how you can work through it. So we adapted it by doing some whole group analyses, so looking what the whole group was saying, but also subgroup analyses, so trying to discern if there was disagreement within pockets of the sample of experts. And then when we saw that there was, we were able to facilitate a sort of debate round and feedback to the experts what their peers were saying, and then saying, well, what do you think in light of this information, and seeing if they were changing their minds. So yeah, it's a really interesting method, I think, that basically has the ability to pool a whole bunch of knowledge and then maybe distill it into something that people essentially agree on.
Yeah, very important in a field that can be so divided at times. And there are so
Yeah.
many experts out there with so much valuable insight. So it makes sense to collaborate and work together to try and reach a consensus and reach a solution to the problem. So I really like that approach. But I can imagine at the same time, there were probably a lot of challenges with taking so many strong opinions and dealing with trying to build consensus. Like, did you have any sort of surprising or really contentious things that were debated in those rounds? And also, I would love to know like a little bit of a summary of like how many rounds did you have to go through and how did you keep track of all of that? If you don't mind giving that insight.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I'll walk you through the rounds first, and then I'll tell
Okay.
you about some contentious items. But yeah, so in our study, we recruited for the first round 89 experts who were coming from 17 different countries, and we walked them through 4 rounds. The first round was open-ended, and it was really simple. The question was just, please list up to 10 variables that are related to the setting that you think are most important to report in psychedelic clinical trials. And they could optionally provide an explanation or a rationale for the variables that they listed, but that wasn't obligatory. And then basically between each round, what we did was summarize all of that input and then feed it back again to them. And so in the second round, we fed them back a list of 49 different items, and we asked them to rate them in terms of how important they think those variables are, and also in terms of how coherent or like understandable, because we also wanted the item itself to make sense and not be redundant or unclear. And so then we took that again, summarized, and blah, blah, blah. And it's within the third round that we were able to facilitate a debate where we highlighted these contentious items and we asked them to reconsider their opinion. And then by the fourth round, it was just feeding them the final list of 30 items that had reached consensus, which is those items are now part of the final guidelines, and asking them, their opinion, both on the guidelines and on the Delphi process itself as a sort of quality control check. So that was the study sort of in a nutshell. And then some contentious items that came up. There was a few interesting ones. One of them was the importance of bathrooms and their proximity to the dosing space. And this item really came from the voices of past clinical trial participants who said that they had had some unpleasant experiences, for example, having to walk through the hallways of a hospital with patients in it under the influence of a psychedelic substance, just in order to get to the bathroom. And that being, really stressful and taking them out of the cocoon or the bubble. And this was interesting because it's something that the clinicians and researchers hadn't really brought up. But when they got that perspective from the participants, the item ended up reaching consensus and people sort of agreed, okay, wow, yeah, maybe that was a blind spot, but that does matter. So that's one example. Another example that came up in the debate process was the importance of cultural safety and cultural competence. This, again, I think highlighted a blind spot in the sample, which was majoritarily white. It initially didn't reach consensus, but it had reached consensus in the pocket of participants that were BIPOC, as we say, like Black, Indigenous people of color, or mixed ethnic backgrounds. And these folks just said, obviously this is crucial. Like, we need to feel a sense of safety as participants, and facilitators or researchers have a responsibility to cultivate their own knowledge and skills and competencies when it comes to catering to people with different cultural backgrounds who speak different languages with different beliefs, whether religious or spiritual. And so that item as well ended up reaching consensus after that debate process. But yeah, so those are just two examples. I can give more, but I think that highlights maybe, the richness that came up through this iterative discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it just points again to the importance of this paper is that if we don't make it sort of standardized to report these things, we can't know like how these cultural factors or like the distance to the bathroom and where you have to walk, like just won't know like how that's impacting the experience if we don't report on it. So yeah, very important.
Exactly. It's as simple as that. Like, if you don't have it, in a sense, in science, it's like if you don't collect the data, then how can it ever become real? You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
if you've never, yeah, if it's never been like written down somewhere, then you don't have the sort of bones of what's necessary to create a hypothesis or anything that's empirically based.
Mhm.
And I, yeah, like, obviously that is limiting and science isn't perfect, but within the confines of sciences, that's an issue.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. And yeah, now for a little bit more of a discussion about the results. You stated in your paper that you came up with, I think it was 30 consensus-based variables
Yeah.
related to context in psychedelic trials. So you don't have to like list out every single one, but if you don't mind giving us some insight on the ones that were most like strongly endorsed as like, yes, this is like a very important setting variable. And then also some variables that people might underestimate or that people like wouldn't really think of as important context factors.
Yeah, for sure. So there was four variables that were spontaneously like mentioned by over half of the experts in the first round when it was like completely open-ended. So I think that's definitely very strongly endorsed. And these include the music, which is not surprising. We know how important that is. So yeah, the music and the soundscapes in the room, if any. The second one was the objects and decorations in the room, which is interesting. Um, I guess people do think about the aesthetics of the dosing space when it comes to setting. That does make sense. Um, the third one was the people present in the room. Again, like not super surprising, but who's there and how many people are there. Whether it's, a researcher, the facilitators, um, perhaps healthcare practitioners that are there, medical staff, etc. And then the last item that over half of the people mentioned was whether the participants have access to nature, whether it be visual, like through a window, or physical, whether like perhaps the session itself is happening in nature. So those were the four items that, like, yeah, a ton of people mentioned. Um, but I think it was interesting that some items were not mentioned a ton at first, but then they did end up like reaching consensus pretty easily. So a few examples of that. One of them was again brought up by the past trial participants, and this was the level of like control or autonomy that participants are given in the trial. So that can range obviously in scope, but a few examples of how that could happen is like, were the participants offered to contribute or choose at all the music playlist that was played or the type of music that was played? Were they allowed to have any type of control on the props? So often participants are going to be wearing blindfolds or a headset. Were they allowed to take them off when they wanted, or were they strongly encouraged to keep them the whole time? Were they allowed to move, walk in the room, get up, stuff like this? Like basically how restrictive versus free was the session for participants? And I thought that was, yeah, interesting and certainly would influence a participant's experience. Another example was, did they have any control on the temperature or on the lighting in the room? People have different sensibilities, and if you're going to be lying down for 6 hours for a psilocybin session, you better be comfortable, right? So if the temperature isn't right, that could really make for a bad time. Another item that came up was whether there was like any disruptions or disturbances or interruptions during the session, and some people talked about having experience of a person barging into the room, like not on purpose, during a dosing session, or there being like drilling noises in the street or some type of thing like that was like unforeseen but obviously would be really jarring. So these are things that I think that do matter and we could easily not think about because maybe we're thinking about best case scenarios, but it's possible that there would be disruptions like this. And then another item that I thought was interesting, a bit more meta, is like the narrative framing that the study team conveys to participants about what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think perhaps teams often operate, within their own set, so to speak, right? Within their own mind space and their own visions of the world. And so they might think that is just like objective, or I don't know how to say it, but if you take a step back and you look at all the different teams across the world that are doing psychedelic research, they have very different reasons for doing it, right? Some people think that these substances are going to induce a mystical experience. Some people think that the experience itself doesn't matter and you're just inducing neuroplasticity. Some people think that it's reconnecting people to their inner healer intelligence. Some people think, like, there's so many different theories as to how this works and how it's healing. And so we're encouraging the teams to take a step back and, think about the narrative that they're conveying to participants, because we do think that that's going to influence the participant experiences.
Yeah, and I know you didn't focus in your study on like which contextual factors are the best to include. It was sort of more like how do we report them so that we can
Yeah,
determine maybe later on which ones are best.
exactly.
But based on the
Yeah.
guidelines that came out of your study, could you give some examples of how a psychedelic trial might change accordingly? And like how exactly are psychedelic scientists supposed to engage with this, like these guidelines and these results, and how can they use them in their research?
Yeah. So I think at a baseline, these guidelines are meant to be like descriptive, not prescriptive. So we're not trying to tell people what to do in their clinical trials. We're just asking them to let us know what they did. Um, and so, yeah, it's the idea is to try to have a description per trial that considers a similar amount of factors. Um, what we recommend is that study teams take these guidelines and they report on each of the items that are relevant, because it's very possible that some of the items just wouldn't apply to their context, either in the main text of their manuscript or in the supplements, where we are mindful that 30 items is a lot. It takes up a lot of space. I mean, our table in the paper takes up a whole page, and sometimes there's word count limits, so it's totally fine to put that in the supplement. And again, to adapt it to what's relevant to the trial. But that's the basic premise of like what we would be asking out of researchers. Um, I want to caveat what I said about it being, descriptive, not prescriptive. We do think that if people start using them and if people intend to use them even before they start their trial, it might make them a little bit more mindful of how they do actually design their trials. Um, but again, we're not advocating for a one size fits all. We're just advocating for like it's important to think about this, and we've been saying it's important to think about this, so let's think about it and let's report it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's the simplest way to say like how we hope these would be used.
Yeah. And what impacts do you hope that these guidelines will have on psychedelic research and maybe like the implications for policy in the future? Like, how big is this for improving scientific rigor in psychedelic science? And could this be something that helps these psychotherapies get approved in the future, you think?
That's what we hope. um, but yeah, I think a big reason for launching this study, and a potential usefulness of the guidelines would be making psychedelic science more reproducible, and more valid and more interpretable. Because right now, if we think about how little information is given about the context of a trial, it almost makes it difficult to interpret the study results. And yeah, so that's the baseline, like sort of like quality improvement, rigor improvement in psychedelic research. um, and then, as you mentioned, on top of that, a hope for the future would be that over time, if people are reporting on these variables, we might start getting, a database that pertains to these extra pharmacological variables. And, a dream would be to have the capacity to eventually do a sort of meta-analysis or systematic review of these variables and see where the strongest signals lie. Because obviously 30 variables is a lot, and we're not going to go, I mean, I doubt we would as a field go and individually study each of them to try to deconstruct and dismantle their differential effects. But I think it would be possible that over time, yeah, stronger signals would start emerging, and maybe these would be trails that would be worth following, um, to understand even better the effect of those specifically strong variables. So that's number two. And yeah, number three, policy wise, I would hope that this would, you know, as it increases the quality of the science, hopefully would also increase the sort of legitimacy of it. And hopefully move us closer towards regulatory approval of these substances. Um, I think a good example of why that is, one of the reasons that was cited in the rejection of the FDA of MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD was that some of the people on the committee said these therapies are too vague. It's like a black box. Like we don't actually really know what's happening. And so I guess the guidelines would try to uncover what lies within that box, and bring to light not only the substance aspect of it, but the container in which it was given.
Yeah. And maybe this could be something that we also do with like other parts of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, not just set and setting, but like the psychotherapy component a lot of the time can be poorly reported on from
Oh my
like,
gosh, yes.
or they just got like some psychological support or like some human interaction to like structured psychotherapy approaches like everywhere in between as well. It's not very well reported at the moment, so it's a good direction that you're taking us in.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, uh, my supervisor, Dr. Greenway, was saying that sometimes we give more, space on a manuscript to describe the furniture than the people and what they actually did, like the therapists. It's kind
Mm,
of crazy.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So, what's next for you and your research and for your research group? I know you mentioned a dream would be like a meta-analysis on these factors, but what's sort of more in the immediate future for you guys?
Yeah, well, I wanted to mention like one caveat about the study that I think I guess might pertain to the next steps, but um, there's this list of 30 variables, but we don't know yet like which ones are the most important.
Mhm.
And I do want to acknowledge as a limitation like that is kind of burdensome, 30 variables, that's a lot, and people have limited time and money and resources to conduct research. So I think one thing that would be interesting in the immediate future would be to try to narrow down on like the must-haves rather than like nice-to-haves, and create maybe a tiered system in terms of what is essential, absolutely essential to report, versus not essential. Um, so yeah, to me that is an important next step as it pertains to this project. But otherwise, we're also working now on a project that came out of this, which is looking at social determinants of health in psychedelic research and how those are reported, because that's actually a variable that came up in the study, but it didn't reach consensus. And the reason for that wasn't because people consider that social determinants of health don't matter, but it's because people were like, how do we like report on this? It's so complex. It's so vast, it's so much information all at once, and so there was this confusion that we sensed among researchers, and maybe discouragement, and so we're trying to tackle that head on. So we're doing some qualitative interviews now with different people in the field, and we're going to create a workshop in the fall to get people to come together and think about this in a sort of live version of a Delphi study. So that's exciting, and that's one of the things that we're working on.
That's so cool. A live Delphi. That's really cool. I haven't heard about that before.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah. Sweet. So, yeah, thank you for walking me through all of that. And this sort of brings us to my last question, which is more of a general sort of question that I ask all of the interviewees. And that's what you think the general population can sort of take away from psychedelic research and its effective reporting in particular.
Yeah. Well, I guess that brings us back to what drew me to the field, which is psychedelic research, especially if it's reported correctly, I think might bring light to the importance of context and to the powerful and synergistic drug context interactions. And I think to me, that is not only fascinating, but crucial to improving mental health care and treatments, not only in psychedelic therapy, but in psychiatry more broadly. That's something I hope push going forward, and to bring into my own practice. And I just think that these contextual variables are such an untapped resource, and I think that if we start paying attention to them, we could really derive like meaningful patient benefits without putting substances into their bodies and without having them to suffer side effects. I think it's just an easy and powerful way to make people's lives better and treatments more effective. So yeah, I think that is a powerful point that is demonstrated in psychedelic assisted therapy and research when well done.
Yes, for sure. And I'm thinking of titling this episode Context Matters, so I hope you're okay with that.
Yeah. Yes, totally. That's like our
Awesome.
tagline.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chloe, for joining me today. It was a pleasure to talk with you, and that just flew by, so I really appreciate you being here.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. Thank you so much for listening to this fascinating conversation with Dr. Chloé Pronovost-Morgan. I'd like to thank the Center for Psychedelics Health and Research at Queen's University and the support of our sponsors at the Ontario Brain Institute, the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression, and Providence Care Hospital. Until next time, be well and integrate wisely.